5, 4, 3.
Okay, let's continue with the Aristotle show. Still politics, still book 1, now chapter 4. All right, so we're digging in a little bit more into the household, or Aristotle's view of it, Aristotle's view on managing it, Aristotle's view on the property in it, etc., etc. And remember, don't lose sight. The story is, how do you manage a polis? How the highest koinonia, the one that has a telos of eudaimonia for a subset of the population, and that is the polis. Again, so polis, eudaimonia, that's the end goal, but we have to go through a number of subsets or composites that are part of this story. And these are all, remember, all these composites that we talk about, or that Aristotle talks about prior to the polis, are in a sense still incomplete. They're not fully formed units that are just there and then you add another one, like blocks, like where you had one block and you add another one. No, not really. More, you can think of it more biologically, as Aristotle said earlier, right? The parts are not really the parts unless they're parts of the whole. And as he gives the example of a hand, this is not really a hand unless it's attached to an arm, to a body, etc., etc. If it were, be lopped off, yeah, it's a sense it's my hand, but it's not really a hand anymore. Things reach their completeness in Aristotle in a certain kind of context when they reach their goals or their right type of environment. Okay, that's how nature is ordered. And the city, the polis, is no different. It follows those rules. All right, so let's look a little bit more on the household. Some preliminary assumptions. There's a huge assumption that I'm going to mention a little bit later, which is kind of obvious to us today, but it shows just how different Aristotle was, that he doesn't regard it as a legitimate assumption. Anyways, I'll get to that in a bit. So some preliminary assumptions. First, property is a part of the household. Now remember, in both of these, I can't stress it enough, we're confined to the household. So he's not talking about businesses and factories and all that stuff. So you have to put that to the side. And the household should be thought of as a relatively small group of people, not a huge number, and like a little family, a nuclear family, if you like that, you can use that term. So property is part of it, and he's going to unpack a little bit more of what property is meant in this. Property should not be thought of as just equivalent to objects, right, and things. No, that's misleading, right? He doesn't mean that. Properties are going to be things with certain purposes. But so not all things, and not all things of all purposes as well. Anyways, we'll get to that in a bit. So, but property is part of the household. You can't have a household without it. The art of acquiring property is part of household management. So in order to have a household, you need property, and you need how to acquire this property. And so Aristotle will talk a lot about the art of acquisition. That's going to be very important, how to run a household. So he offers a justification of 1 and 2. He says, look, it's impossible to live well. This, even though the household is not the highest koinonia, right? It's not the highest community. That's the polis. You still have to have it as part of the polis in order to eventually reach a community like the polis, in which some people get to achieve eudaimonia. So you still need these, the household, and you need these parts of it. If you don't have that, you can't have a household, and ultimately you won't be able to live well at all. So if you don't have a household, if you don't have these, you won't have a household. If you don't have a household, you won't live well. So the justification of this is ultimately tied to the big picture of you can't have a polis if you don't have a household, and you can't have a household if you don't have these. So Aristotle is always stressing living well, right? So it's you always got to think of it in terms of having a nice life. The polis is ultimately to have the best life, but the household is also to live well in and of itself. Not as complete as the polis, but it's all ultimately for living well. So keep that in mind when you're reading and thinking about Aristotle's discussion here. Now, it's another point to keep in mind, in addition to all the stuff about biology, is this distinction that we saw back in the lectures on the Nicomachean Ethics. Go back and review them if you need to, but in the Nicomachean Ethics, book 6, when he was talking about intellectual virtues and all that stuff, in chapter 4, he made an important distinction. And it plays a role in a lot of Aristotle's philosophy, especially his ethics and his politics. And that is the distinction between making and doing. And normally what are you doing? What are you making? Remember, we use those words interchangeably. So in order to keep it a little bit distinctive, like what are you making versus doing, instead of doing, I'll use Aristotle's word, which is praxis. And if you recall, the whole idea to distinguish between the two is the making, it's a process, and praxis can be one too. So that's okay, so far they're the same. But if you recall, the key thing here is that the process, when it's making, the process produces an end good. Same here. However, the process, shall we say, and I'll symbolize it by drawing a little, the end good is external to the process. And that sounds more complicated than it is. Baking bread is an example of making. It's a process. You're baking the loaf. You're doing all the stuff that's necessary. But the final thing is not like you might say you like baking, and fine, I do too, that's okay. But really, ultimately, the good that's produced, the telos of the story, is to have the finished product. And then you say, oh, look at what I did. I got a loaf of bread out of the deal. So the end good is external. Well, let's emphasize that. So we're producing externalities, right? That's not really what's going on in the household. It's not making. Households are not places for making. They're places for doing. And in the doing, the end good is part of the process. Kind of like when you do hobbies, right? Even if you've got a hobby, even where the result is, let's say, I don't know, you're building a model or something, it's not really as external. That is that the process of building the model is really the whole thing. It's the pleasure of it. You might even build a model and give it away. I've done that when I was younger. You just build a model, and it was not really for the actual thing you build. It's for the entire process. That's really the end good. The end good is bound up with the process. As a matter of fact, you really shouldn't even think of it as process and good. It's a good in process. That's a praxis for Aristotle, and that's the key thing. That's really what makes life great, and that's what's going on in the household. So the household management then is the property here, again, is not for making. So it's the household is not a place like a factory where you produce products or things like that. That's a different story. So when Aristotle's talking about slavery, for him, it's always within this context of praxis, not making. Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, he's got some preliminary assumptions. And don't forget, he's got a big one that I haven't said yet, but you can probably guess it, but all will be revealed momentarily. Some other assumptions that he's got is that each art has a definite sphere, he says. A definite sphere which must have its instruments if that art is to discharge its functions. In other words, if you have an art that you're trying to do and you've got a sphere of operation, well, you need the instruments that are requisite in order to discharge that art, in order to do it, right? So if your art is painting or whatever, of course, you're going to need paints and brushes, and if your art is baking or whatever, you're going to need these instruments. So household management is like an art. So it too needs its proper instrument. So it's going to need its property. Now, if you notice, I've drawn a line from the term proper instruments to this one. In other words, proper instruments divides into two kinds, Aristotle says, the animate and the inanimate. All right, so what does he mean by this? Well, he gives us a little example. Now, part of the problem with some of Aristotle's discussion here is it's not always clear. The text looks kind of jumbled up and it is arguably corrupted in places, but we'll try to do the best we can. What seems to be going on is this. He gives us this example of a pilot of a ship. And he says, look, what's going on here? The pilot of a ship, the art that's involved is the art of navigation. And what's the end, the telos? Well, basically, is to bring about a certain state, namely to arrive at a destination. That's what the art of navigation is all about. It's ultimately there to arrive at a destination. You pick a destination and you do this navigation in order to bring about this telos. Okay, and how do you achieve the telos? Well, the art of navigation basically in this, if we think about like a boat, just to make it very concrete, you got to steer the thing. Well, how do you steer the thing? Well, Aristotle says in order to steer, again, about the things about all the instruments and that, to steer, instruments are needed. And what are the instruments that are needed? Well, if you know a little bit about ships, you know they have a rudder on them and the rudder in the back, okay. So that's an inanimate instrument. That's part of the steering. But Aristotle says the other one is you need someone to, like maybe if you're at the back and you're the pilot of the ship and you're steering it, you can't really see what's in front. So you have a lookout man. And in that sense, you would, your lookout man would be like an instrument that the instrument of the lookout man is to tell you, hey, turn right or turn left, there's the rocks there, or something. So, or some kind of instructions you would get from the lookout. So you'd have these two instruments, and they are of different kinds. So, to steer the household, if I can sort of continue that metaphor, then you need, Aristotle says, both animate and inanimate. So each item of property here, as we said, is not for making, but for praxis. So steering the household, the slave, in Aristotle's view, is just kind of like the lookout man. Might help you giving instructions on steering it. You're the sort of the pilot in it, and the slave is like a lookout. They're not producing anything like a good. Sorry, like an externalized good. I should got to be clear about that. So they're not making stuff. The slave is property of the animate sort, and is important to helping to run the household. Now, Aristotle says, look, can we envision situations? Because you might right away say, oh, come on. You don't necessarily have to have an animate instrument here. There could be other ways of getting around, like maybe you could hook the mechanism up where you stand at the front and you have a wheel and it turns the rudder at the back. So you can eliminate the animate instrument by just kind of some sort of drive mechanism that runs from the wheel at the front and turns the rudder at the back. So that's an easy refutation. Well, yeah, certainly. And somebody like Aristotle would be aware of this. And he says this. Is it possible to imagine situations where you don't need like an animate instrument? Right? Some translations are living tools or whatever. But can you get around that? Aristotle says, of course. There's plenty of situations that we can imagine. So the master-slave link, Aristotle he's not saying it's universal, that it's needed everywhere. Aristotle would no doubt recognize that if you had a large-scale operation that had slaves and let's say it was like a mining operation or something, right? Or any kind of operation where you had slaves, it could, in principle, if somebody invented a machine that could do that work and then the master just controlled the machine, like analogous to the way that the pilot could have a wheel which has a drive mechanism back to the rudder, you don't need a slave. So this notion of the master-slave, although Aristotle says it's natural, it's not going to be like a universal for every context, and it's unbreakable. Anytime you want something done, you got to have a master and a slave. That is an animate instrument. So that shouldn't be thought of as absolute. Instead, it applies in certain circumstances. And he still wants to say that it applies in the household. And remember, the household is not for making. It's for praxis. It's for doing. So, again, if the shuttle, Aristotle's example, like the shuttle which you use for weaving, if a master could say, oh, shuttle, I direct you, I command you, or if the shuttle on its own could weave clothes, there would be no need for anyone else to be an intermediary and be in this position of being an animate instrument. But again, that's not the kind of property that Aristotle really is talking about when he talks about property of a household. The property of a household is more things like for good living, right? Like not so much like making clothes, but the having of clothes. Not so much, making beds, but the having of a bed. So what the slave is for, in Aristotle's view, seems to be, it's hard to say exactly what he thinks in all circumstances, but the slave seems to be in the sense of like a personal butler, something like that, where the slave is helping the master to live well, not by producing objects, but kind of like in the sense of doing housework. Whereas if you think about doing housework, right, sort of the drudgery of doing that, as they say, it's not something anyone notices unless you don't do it. But what is housework? Well, does it really produce another object? Not really. It's not like a production it's not a making like in the way that baking bread is. So in the sense that the housework is like, keeping things organized, keeping things tidy, and the slave would be like laying the master's towels out for the bath and things like that. So you can think of it in a sense of what seems to come out of Aristotle's analysis here is, again, the slave is not somebody that's building stuff. The slave is just making the master's life really nice by pouring the drinks while the masters talk about philosophy and things like that. If you look at a Platonic dialogue, that seems to be sort of what Aristotle is after when he talks about property in the household. Now, Aristotle then goes on, and this is leading up to the big presupposition. He says, look, possessions, well, they're related to possessors like parts to a whole. A part is not just a part, but it belongs essentially to the whole, that it takes its identity from it, and its whole thing is bound up with the whole. So the possessor, like the master, owns the possessed in shall we say, completely as a totality, and the possessor doesn't really own him or himself. So you can see where this is going now, that the slave is an instrument for praxis, right? So the good of the slave is in the actions of the slave, like maybe making a bed or pouring the drinks or something like that. Not as in making things, as in producing goods. That's something a little bit different. But of course, the big presupposition that Aristotle makes, he doesn't even mention it in any way, and it's the one that, no doubt, when we hear a term like slave, is not so much of the activities of the slave, but the fundamental thing that I think strikes us now, certainly the first time I encountered this, was Aristotle doesn't seem to regard it as morally problematic, like intrinsically. He certainly does not agree that it is intrinsically immoral to regard a human being as property, right? Basically, that humans can own humans. That's not, as somebody like Kant would say, that it's an axiom that you cannot convert a subjectivity like a human into an objectivity like property. So that's like a morally ontological no-go. You can't change one into the other in any justified way. So it's absolutely morally forbidden that a human owns another human. And that is something that does not seem, it might be questionable to Aristotle, But he clearly does not regard it as absolutely fundamental that a human being cannot own another human being. And that seems to be at the root of getting all the arguments off the ground for slavery, because at the end of the day, that's usually how these arguments work, is that once you get that presupposition that people can't own people, once you get that out of the way, then you can start arguing about it and bringing in all these other kinds of ideas and whatnot. And then, as Aristotle later on will do, is try to justify it. But he needs to basically ignore that. Now, did he deliberately ignore it? Was it not? Probably, in a sense. It may not have made sense to him. It may not have dug much into his mind, that idea. He might have thought that it's basically, it's in principle maybe a neutral notion, and if it's done right, it's acceptable, or it could be done wrong. Nowadays, I think most of us would solidly agree there's no way that you can have morally justified ownership of human beings. All right, so that sets up the first bit of the discussion of the nature of slavery. See you next video.